On an April morning in the Caribbean, a U.S. military strike sank a boat, killing 11 people. The White House called it a precision strike against a Venezuelan cartel tied to Nicolas Maduro. But here's the question: was this really a lawful act of self-defense or an illegal attack in international waters? Experts are already warning it could qualify as an extrajudicial killing. So, what did the U.S. actually target, and just how shaky is the legal ground it's standing on? Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. A boat moving slowly across the southern Caribbean was reduced to flames in seconds. Radar logs show it was operating beyond national waters, drifting in a corridor often used for smuggling. The strike that destroyed it came so quickly that the wooden hull broke apart before most of the crew even realized what hit them. The U.S. military later described the vessel as an expeditionary drug boat, carrying narcotics bound for Central America. What triggered such a lethal response wasn't routine law enforcement, but a decision to treat this target as part of a bigger militarized threat. From the air, surveillance crews marked the boat as a hostile craft, suspending it in crosshairs before releasing precision ordnance. Seconds after impact, orange fire lit the sea. 11 people were dead, their bodies either thrown into the ocean or consumed by flames, while pieces of the wreckage drifted across the waves. The coordinates placed the blast line several miles from the Venezuelan coast, in open water where jurisdiction has always been contested. On one hand, U.S. officials framed the action as defensive, warning of traffickers tied directly to violent cartels. On the other, regional observers wondered if those killed were in fact smugglers, or if they might have included crew with no direct combat role. The justification came at a press briefing. Standing at the podium, President Trump told the press the United States had struck a boat connected to Venezuela's Tren de Aragua gang. He described the sinking as proof that Washington was not simply tracking drugs, but dismantling networks he labeled as terrorists. By tying the crew of that single vessel to a specific cartel, he elevated a criminal investigation into something resembling a military campaign. Critics argued that changing the language from traffickers to terrorists wasn't just semantics. It reshaped the legal and political frame around every subsequent U.S. action in the region. Context matters here. At that moment, America had already mobilized heavily around Latin America's waters. Several destroyers cruised the Caribbean. Amphibious assault ships carried Marines off the coast. Patrol aircraft circled international shipping lanes, while Coast Guard cutters coordinated with Navy escorts. In total, thousands of personnel were deployed, forming one of the region's largest maritime footprints in years. Against that backdrop, targeting a single boat seemed less about stopping narcotics than about sending a signal. It raised a question: why treat what looked like a smuggling run with the full weight of counter-terror operations? Up to that morning, drug interdictions mounted by Washington had rarely crossed into kinetic strikes. Most were done through boarding, seizure, and prosecution. Bombing a boat changed that. It marked the first open military attack linked specifically to suspected traffickers after the force buildup began. That shift cut through the standard playbook of chasing, disabling engines, or arresting smugglers on deck. Instead, it carried the hallmarks of how the United States targets armed insurgents. By calling Tren de Aragua a terrorist group, Washington blurred distinctions between organized crime and combatant insurgency, treating them as identical under the rules of war. For the families of the dead, there was no distinction. Out at sea, flames turned the night sky red, and by daybreak, nothing remained but charred debris washing ashore. 11 lives lost, a boat sunk, and a clear declaration from Washington. This was not just about drugs moving north. It was about confronting what America considered a terrorist network operating from Venezuelan soil. Yet that conclusion left unanswered the larger concern. Sinking a boat with firepower is one kind of act. Proving to the world that such an attack complied with international norms is another challenge entirely. A boat destroyed, 11 men gone in a flash. But was the United States standing on solid ground or drifting into waters no one has mapped out legally? That's the puzzle. A single order from the Oval Office unleashed a strike in open seas. But who actually gave the president permission to wield lethal force in international waters against men who weren't soldiers, weren't pirates, and weren't flying any flag of war? Presidents have long claimed authority to use force against threats abroad, especially under the umbrella of counterterrorism. Yet here the target wasn't a militia or known insurgents, but a vessel accused of drug trafficking. That step muddied the boundary between law enforcement and war. If smuggling gangs can be hit with air power simply by labeling them terrorists, then the president's power to kill in regions far removed from active battlefields becomes almost limitless. Even scholars closely tracking U.S. security decisions have said that what happened in the Caribbean resembled something closer to an extrajudicial execution than to an armed conflict kill. To them, Washington had acted as both police officer, judge, and executioner, but without the trial or the arrest in between. On the high seas, the world relies on a treaty called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. This massive agreement lays down which states can police certain waters, how ships must be treated, and what counts as piracy or illegal activity. Every major maritime nation has signed on, except, notably, the United States. Washington treats UNCLOS like customary law, but never ratified it. If you're not legally bound to it, how firm is your legal cover when taking down a boat in international waters? Then comes the harder challenge of defining who was on that boat. Was Tren de Aragua a cartel, a transnational gang, or a terrorist organization? International law makes a sharp distinction. Criminals are to be arrested and prosecuted, while armed groups in wartime can be treated as combatants. Flattening the difference removes the protections ordered under the laws of armed conflict, which only permit military force against clearly hostile fighters. What if even one of those 11 killed wasn't a combatant? That presence could undercut Washington's justification entirely, transforming the strike from a raid on enemies to the unlawful killing of civilians. Regional voices grew louder once the news broke. Caracas denounced the strike as aggression, rejecting every claim about armed traffickers on board. Within hours, Venezuelan troops deployed along beachheads, patrol craft moved closer to their territorial waters, and state television repeated messages that U.S. forces had murdered innocents. That posture, whether rhetorical or tactical, made clear Venezuela regarded the sinking as an attack on its sovereignty. Then came a twist that deepened suspicions. State media in Caracas went further, alleging that the Pentagon's own video of the strike may not have been genuine at all. Officials hinted it could have been artificially generated footage designed to reinforce Washington's story. True or not, the allegation opened a separate battlefield, one fought not with missiles, but with claims of fabrication, manipulation, and narrative warfare. If the evidence of the strike was in doubt, then the legitimacy of the action itself hung under even darker clouds, so the legality is not settled. Instead, the United States has ignited a far larger argument about definitions, sovereignty, and the threshold between policing and war. Can a government declare a criminal syndicate a terrorist force and destroy it at sea? Or does that set a precedent where law enforcement ends overnight and is replaced by sudden bombardments? For Washington, the choice may have been strategic, but for the Caribbean and Latin America, it was a signal of pressure aimed not only at gangs but at Maduro himself. What happened in the Caribbean was more than a strike on a drug boat. It was a test of how far America is willing to stretch the definition of legitimate targets at sea. When gangs become terrorists by declaration, missiles replace handcuffs, and the line between policing crime and waging war begins to blur. 11 men died, but the larger question lingers. Was the goal to stop narcotics or to send a warning across Latin America? Viewers need to decide whether this was law enforcement at sea or the opening move in shaping power far beyond Venezuela's waters.